Hey guys, tonight we're starting with something cozy, which of course means we're going to talk about the posthumous journeys of women accused of witchcraft. So if you haven't already, dim your lights, pull the blankets up, and settle into the soft hum of historical misery. Because there is nothing quite as soothing as the bureaucratic logistic of disposing of a body that the authorities just couldn't stop calling evil. You know how today, after someone dies, there's a whole respectful system. Funeral homes, flowers, maybe a Spotify playlist of Adele's song, something gentle. Well, medieval Europe said, no thanks. If you were accused of witchcraft, your funeral plans were basically fire, rope, shovel, and maybe a few public gawkers throwing cabbages. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't dignified, and it definitely wasn't restful. And the funny part, they really believed they were solving something, like burning a poor woman's body was somehow going to stop the devil from clocking in tomorrow morning. Spoiler, it didn't. But that didn't stop centuries of people from trying. So let's slowly wander into this strange smoky world, burned to nothing, or not quite. First things first, the classic witch-burning image. Flames, screaming crowds, someone in a big hat yelling about Satan. And yes, burning was common. But here's the little historical hiccup. Burning didn't always mean you were burned alive. Sometimes the authorities strangled you first, then set your body on fire, which feels like one of those congratulations but not really situations. Now, why burning? It wasn't just because fire is dramatic, it was symbolic. Fire was thought to purify, to cleanse, to reduce the witch to nothingness so her soul couldn't come back and haunt the village. Because nothing says job done like turning someone into a pile of ash. But here's the practical issue. Fires don't always work the way you want them to. Human bodies take a lot of fuel to completely burn down, and medieval Europe wasn't exactly sitting on endless supplies of dry firewood. Many burned witches ended up only half cremated. You might have a torso left or a skull staring out of the embers. Not exactly a clean finish. So what did they do with the leftovers? Often they buried them on the spot. Shallow graves near the execution ground, covered in a thin crust of dirt and shame. Sometimes body parts were carted away as souvenirs, which is, horrifying. But hey, who wouldn't want a nice femur to remind you of a fun afternoon of witch burning? Medieval people collected weird stuff. The unholy graveyards. Let's float over to burial practices, because not every witch was flambéed like a marshmallow. Some were hanged, drowned, or otherwise executed in ways that left the body intact, which created a problem. Where do you put them? You couldn't just put an accused witch in the churchyard. That would risk contaminating holy ground with, demonic vibes. So instead, they were buried in places nobody wanted to visit. Crossroads, for example. The idea was that burying them at a road junction would confuse their restless spirit, as if ghosts were easily tricked by traffic patterns. Other times they were dumped in bogs, rivers, or even pits outside town walls. Basically, anywhere you wouldn't have to think about them again. The idea was that if the body was denied proper burial, the soul couldn't rest, which paradoxically was also what people wanted. Eternal unrest was supposed to be a punishment. Medieval logic, 10-10, consistent. In Scotland, where witch hunting really flourished, you'll sometimes find memorial plaques today marking these spots. But back then, it was usually just an unmarked hole, out of sight, out of mind, unless, of course, the body floated up again, which did happen. Nothing says awkward morning like walking past the river and spotting Margaret the accused bobbing around on the surface like an angry pool toy. Body as a warning. Another cheery custom, displaying the corpse. If you were hanged as a witch, your body might be left dangling for days, weeks, even months. The message was simple. Look what happens if you annoy the magistrate. It was less about Satan and more about local politics. Because witch trials weren't just about magic, they were about control. In some cases, parts of the body were literally nailed to the town gates. A hand, a foot, a head. Imagine walking to market and passing the same blackened hand every morning on your way to buy onions. Very motivational, very hygienic. And of course, kids would dare each other to go touch it, because kids are kids in every century. Bones don't stay put. Here's the twist. Centuries later, when archaeologists dig around execution sites, they sometimes find these scattered remains. Burnt bones, twisted skeletons, even teeth buried in shallow soil. And the funny part, these bones have often been moved more than once. Sometimes villagers would later dig them up just to rebury them deeper. Or, in the 19th century, when attitudes changed, people would dig them up again to give them a proper burial. It's like the world couldn't stop rearranging the poor women's bones. One example. In Lancashire, England, the so-called Pendle witches were executed in 1612. Their bodies were left in an unmarked pit, forgotten for centuries. Then in the 20th century, construction workers may have uncovered bones near the site, sparking debates about whether these were the witches. Of course, historians argue about it endlessly because nothing makes scholars happier than ruining a good ghost story. The odd afterlife of ashes. And then there's ashes. If the burning actually succeeded, the ashes were sometimes collected and scattered in rivers to wash away the witch forever. Other times they were buried at the gallows site. And sometimes, yes, they were kept. Because people believed ashes had magical power. The irony is delicious. They killed someone for being magical, then pocketed the remains as protective charms. Humanity, ladies and gentlemen. In parts of Germany, villagers sprinkled witch ashes on their crops. Supposedly, it kept pests away. Nothing says eco-friendly pesticide like powdered human. The whisper of dignity. Not every witch stayed in disgrace forever. In modern times, many countries have issued apologies. Towns have put up memorials. Churches have held services, and historians have dug through court records to clear names. It's centuries too late, of course. But it shows how uncomfortable we still are about what happened. The bodies are long gone, but the guilt lingers. It also makes you wonder, what would the accused women have thought, knowing their names would eventually be carved into plaques and read out in apologies? Probably something along the lines of, "Thanks, but I'd rather not have been strangled and set on fire in the first place." And that's just the first drift across this subject. Burning, burying, displaying, scattering. Every community had its own way of turning paranoia into funeral arrangements. The fascinating part isn't just what they did with the bodies, it's the belief behind it, the deep fear that death wasn't enough, that even in the grave these women held power. So let's keep gliding forward. because as grim as this is, it's only the beginning. Witches weren't the only ones whose bodies got the bizarre treatment. Royals, nobles, even ordinary criminals all ended up as post-mortem cautionary tales. And trust me, the medieval imagination never wasted an opportunity to make death theatrical. So, let's drift a little further down the dim, candlelit hallway of weird history. We've burned the witches, buried them at crossroads, sprinkled their ashes on turnips. You know, the usual, but now we're going to talk about a profession that honestly sounds like something invented by a medieval intern who had no business making decisions. The job, Sin Eater? Yes, that was an actual occupation, a literal person you could hire to come to a funeral, sit by the corpse, and eat food placed on or near the body, with the belief that in doing so they absorbed the dead person's sin. Because why not? So what exactly was a sin eater? Picture this, it's rural Wales, maybe the 17th century. A villager has died, probably from something glamorous like smallpox or falling off a wobbly ladder. The family is distraught, worried that dear Uncle Griffith's soul won't make it to heaven because, well, he wasn't exactly a saint. Maybe he stole some sheep. Maybe he swore a bit too much. Maybe he skipped church a few dozen times. Enter the Sin Eater, a poor, scraggly man, always poor, always scraggly, this was not a job for your local lord, is summoned to the house. He comes in, already smelling faintly of ale and failure, and sits by the coffin. The family places bread and beer on the body. The Sin Eater consumes it, symbolically taking on the sins of the deceased. And just like that, problem solved. Uncle Griffith's soul is squeaky clean, ready for heaven. Meanwhile, the Sin Eater walks away with the burden of everybody else's sins, which, you know, is just what you want when you're already living in a hut with a leaky roof, the social outcast with a job. Here's the twist. No one liked Sin Eaters. They were considered spiritually contaminated, cursed even. I mean, if your business card says, absorb sins for cash, people are going to avoid sitting next to you at the tavern. So the Sin Eater lived a paradox. Communities needed him, but also despised him. They'd pay him a few coins, give him a crust of bread, and then shun him the rest of the year. He was tolerated only because he was useful at funerals. It's the historical version of having a weird uncle who you only invite over to fix the plumbing. And it's worth noting, sin eating wasn't exactly official church policy. The church frowned on it because it was basically spiritual freelancing. But in remote areas where priests weren't always available, sin eaters filled a gap. Think of them as the Uber Eats of the afterlife, except instead of delivering food, they delivered salvation. The ritual details. The ceremony was usually simple. Bread and beer were the staples, sometimes cheese. The food was placed on the chest or near the coffin of the dead. The sin eater would recite a short prayer, then eat and drink. The idea was that the sins physically passed into him. People truly believed in the transference, which raises questions. Did the sin eater keep a mental list of all the sins he was carrying? Did he wake up in this morning and think, ah yes, today I'm weighted down by adultery, sheep theft, and a very unfortunate card game debt? And of course it also made him terrifying. If you think about it, the sin eater was walking around with hundreds of lifetimes of sin inside him. No wonder nobody wanted to share a beer with him. He was basically radioactive. Where did it happen? The practice is most famously associated with Wales and the Welsh borderlands, but similar customs existed in parts of England, Scotland, and maybe even as far as the Alps. Anywhere rural where superstition thrived and priests weren't always handy. It probably had pre-Christian roots. Old pagan beliefs about transferring guilt and cleansing the community. The church tried to stamp it out. of course, because it smelled like heresy. But you know how it is, rural customs die hard. People don't just give up a good sin transfer system because a bishop gets cranky. The last known professional sin eater in England was a man named Richard Munslow, who died in 1906, which is shockingly late. The Edwardian era was supposed to be modern, full of trains and gramophones. Meanwhile, in Shropshire, someone was still hiring a guy to eat sandwiches off Grandma's coffin. History never fails to remind us that modern is relative. The irony, here's where it gets deliciously ironic. The sin eater, despised and shunned in life, carried everyone's sins. And yet when he died, who ate his sins? Nobody. By definition, he died condemned. The man who gave salvation to others couldn't have it himself. It's almost poetic, almost biblical. He was like a low-budget Jesus, except instead of dying on the cross, he just keeled over from bad ale. Sin eating in popular memory. Today, sin eating has become a little historical curiosity. It pops up in horror novels, movies, and the occasional spooky folktale. But back then, it was deadly serious. People believed without hesitation. Death was scary, sins were heavy, and anything that promised to help was worth trying, even if it meant hiring your least favorite neighbor to chew bread in a corner. Folklorists who interviewed old villagers in the 19th century often found a lingering memory of it. People whispered about the sin man who used to come around muttering prayers and carrying a look like he hadn't slept in a decade. And of course, some communities quietly rewrote history later. Families didn't like to admit they'd ever hired a sin eater. It looked superstitious, backward, even embarrassing. So in official records it vanished, but oral memory, gossip and folklore kept the figure alive. Modern echoes. Now if you're wondering, no, we don't really have sin eaters today, unless you count therapists, bartenders, or that one friend who always ends up listening to everyone else's problems at 3 a.m. The principle is kind of the same. You pour your guilt into them and they carry it home. But in terms of actual ritual, it's gone, probably for the best. Though I can't help but imagine what a 21st century sin eater would look like. Showing up in sweatpants, pulling out a Starbucks Frappuccino, mumbling, "Yeah, sure, I'll take the adultery. Just Venmo me later." The quiet tragedy. Beneath the weirdness, there's a sadness here. The sin eater was always poor, always desperate. He didn't choose the job because it was glamorous. He chose it because no other work would take him. Communities used him, then cast him aside. And yet, at the end of the day, he gave people comfort. He made death a little less terrifying. It's haunting to think about a lonely man sitting by a coffin, chewing bread while everyone else averted their eyes, taking in the sins of the dead, then walking back to his cottage heavier than before. And that's the strange lullaby of history. Some of the most forgotten people carried the heaviest load. So now let's drift onward again, from witches burned into ash to poor men eating sins. The theme is clear. People have always tried to manage death in bizarre, symbolic ways, because deep down we're uncomfortable with it. We want to control it, tidy it up, make it less terrifying. And sometimes that means turning it into ritual or spectacle, or, in the next case, a meal that might actually kill you. All right. We've burned witches, we've made the poor sin eater eat sins like some medieval garbage disposal. And now we drift into another oddly underappreciated job, the royal food taster. You know, the guy whose whole career plan was basically eat this, maybe die. Sounds fun, right? Imagine writing that on your resume. Special skills, chewing, swallowing, occasionally foaming at the mouth. Why did royals need food tasters? Well, let's remember, royals weren't universally loved. Shocking, I know. Kings and queens had enemies, lots of them. Nobles who wanted the throne. Courtiers who were jealous, neighbors with ambitions. sometimes even their own families. Poisoning became the discreet weapon of choice. Quick, quiet, no messy swords or rebellions, just slip something into the stew and poof, problem solved. So naturally monarchs became paranoid about what landed on their plates. And if you're paranoid, the obvious solution is to make someone else eat your dinner first. If they survive, you dig in. If not, well, guess you're having bread and water tonight. It's the culinary version of you go first. The life of a taster. What was it actually like? Being a royal food taster wasn't glamorous. You didn't wear a crown. You didn't sit on a throne. You stood awkwardly at the side of the banquet, waiting to sample every dish before it touched royal lips. You'd nibble on the roasted goose, sip the spiced wine, maybe chew a suspicious-looking pastry, and then wait. Just stand there for a bit, giving everyone a chance to see if your face started turning blue. Talk about pressure. One wrong swallow and dinner becomes your funeral. And of course, imagine the nerves. Everyone else is casually chatting, toasting, making jokes about hunting. You're silently praying the venison doesn't contain arsenic. That's not exactly a relaxing meal. Famous food tasters. The role existed across many cultures. Ancient Rome had them. Renaissance courts had them. Even in Japan, shoguns employed tasters. If there was power and paranoia, there was probably someone standing nearby with a plate and a very nervous stomach. One of the more famous modern examples, Hitler. Yes, Adolf Hitler had a whole team of food tasters during World War II. He was terrified of being poisoned, and with good reason, considering how many people hated him. A woman named Margot Volk later testified that she was forced to taste his meals. She said the food was vegetarian, mostly rice, vegetables, and sauces, and every meal was terrifying. She never knew if it would be her last bite. So yeah, being a food taster didn't always end with a fancy pension. Was the job effective? Here's the funny bit. Not really. Many poisons don't act instantly. Arsenic, for example, could take hours or days to show symptoms. So a food taster could happily chew away, smile, look fine, and then keel over later, long after the king had already eaten the same dish. So why keep them around? Because appearances mattered. The sight of someone sampling the king's food reassured everyone. It created the illusion of safety. Even if the science was shaky, it was more theater than medicine. But then again, royal courts loved theater. Half of monarchy was just staging anyway. Crowns, robes, rituals. Why not add a man chewing bread dramatically in the corner? Poison mania. Let's float a little deeper. The fear of poison in royal courts was almost obsessive, especially in Renaissance Italy, where poison became practically a family hobby. The Borgias, for instance, were notorious for it. Whether or not they were as murderous as legend says, their reputation alone was enough to make everyone eye their soup nervously. This paranoia spread across Europe. Kings and queens carried antidotes, wore amulets, and kept alchemists on staff. Some even trained themselves to take small doses of poison to build immunity, which, let's be clear, is not how it works. But tell that to a 16th century monarch who thinks mercury cures everything, and through it all, the food taster remained, always nibbling, always waiting, always expendable. The perks and the pitfalls. Now, was it all bad? Not entirely. Food tasters did get perks. They were usually part of the royal household, which meant steady pay, free meals, and close proximity to power. If you survived long enough, you could earn trust and maybe climb the rank. But the pitfalls, obvious. Instant death was one, constant anxiety another, plus you weren't exactly loved by the kitchen staff. Imagine being the chef, spending hours crafting a glorious meal, only to have some sweaty taster drool on it first. Not ideal. And let's not forget, if the king did die of poison, suspicion often fell on the taster. After all, wasn't it your job to prevent this? Which means you weren't just expendable, you were also a convenient scapegoat. So the job description basically read, eat delicious food, maybe die, and also get blamed if your boss dies. Sounds like every customer service role ever. The ritual of trust. There was also a symbolic element here. Watching someone else taste your food reinforced the idea that the king's body was sacred. He couldn't risk contamination. He was too important. His life was literally worth more than anyone else's. The taster, on the other hand, was there to prove that point. His life was worth less. A chewable shield, if you will. Every bite reminded everyone in the hall that the monarch's body was not just flesh and blood, but destiny and dynasty, which is a very fancy way of saying, you chew first, peasant, the slow fade of the profession. Eventually, as political systems modernized and kitchens became a little less murderous, the role of food taster faded. By the 18th and 19th centuries, it was less common. Monarchs still feared assassination, but guns and bombs became more fashionable than poison. Also, advances in chemistry made detecting poison easier, and honestly, monarchs got tired of the whole song and dance. Having a guy hovering with a fork wasn't exactly the vibe for Enlightenment dining. Today, the role technically still exists in a few places. Some leaders keep bodyguards or aides who sample meals, but it's rare, mostly ceremonial. The modern equivalent is a security detail checking your bottled water, much less theatrical, much less fatal. The irony again. And here's where history loves to wink. For all the paranoia, for all the tasters, amulets, antidotes, and theatrics, the number of monarchs who actually died from poison is relatively small. Most died from boring things, disease, bad medical care, or just being stabbed in the middle of the night. The food tasters lived in fear of a threat that was, statistically, less common than gout. Imagine dedicating your whole life to avoiding poison, only for your king to die of dysentery because he insisted on drinking unboiled water. Very on brand. A sleepy reflection. So what did royal food tasters actually experience? Anxiety, suspicion, occasional indigestion, maybe some fleeting glory when they managed to keep the king alive for another day, but mostly they lived in the shadow of someone else's paranoia. Their story reminds us of something important. Power always comes with fear, and the people at the bottom, the expendables, the eaters, the testers, were the ones who carried it, sometimes literally in their stomachs. And that's where we'll pause, letting the clink of goblets fade into the background, because, as strange as it sounds, the paranoia of monarchs wasn't unique. The plague, that great equalizer, forced entire societies to invent their own rituals of protection. And some of those rituals involved some of the strangest figures in history. Which brings us to the long-nosed, bird-masked doctors who haunted the streets of Black Death Europe. So we've wandered through witch ashes, sin sandwiches, and the constant indigestion of royal food tasters. Now, let's glide into a profession that really cemented itself in our cultural imagination. The plague doctor. You know the look. Black cloak, wide-brimmed hat, long bird-like mask. Basically the medieval cosplay that still shows up every Halloween. But the truth is, behind that eerie beak wasn't some mysterious figure of medical wisdom. It was usually just a tired guy with a questionable degree and even more questionable hygiene. And when they took off that mask, well, things got even less glamorous. The outfit that launched 1,000 nightmares. First, let's talk about that mask, because we all know it, but very few stop to ask why. The beak wasn't for style points, though let's be honest, it was a look. It was designed to hold herbs, spices, or vinegar-soaked cloth. The idea was that bad air or miasma spread the plague. If you could filter the stink, you could filter the disease. So plague doctors stuffed their beaks with rosemary, mint, juniper, maybe a little garlic. Basically, they walked around smelling like a chaotic kitchen pantry. Did it help? Not even slightly, but at least it made the job olfactorily tolerable. The rest of the outfit was designed to cover the body. Long waxed coat, gloves, boots, hat. In theory, it was protective. In practice, It was more like wearing a sauna suit while trudging through death-filled street. And under all that, sweat. So much sweat. Taking the mask off probably felt like peeling your face out of a damp tent. Romantic, isn't it? Who became a plague doctor? Here's the fun bit. Plague doctors weren't usually the best doctors. In fact, many weren't trained doctors at all. The actual respected physicians of the time wanted nothing to do with the plague. They stayed with their rich patrons, politely ignoring the dying masses. So cities and towns often hired whoever was available, medical students, barbers, second-rate healers, or just guys who knew how to write their name. The pay was steady. Municipalities promised salaries, sometimes even housing, but the risk was obvious. It's the historical equivalent of, we need a volunteer for the dangerous job nobody else wants. Any takers? And shockingly, only the desperate said yes. Daily life with the mask off. So what did they do when they weren't stomping around in bird cosplay? Well, plague doctors had surprisingly boring lives. They wrote reports on death counts. They signed certificates for burial. They occasionally prescribed treatments, which usually involved bloodletting, herbal poultices, or telling people to drink weird concoctions like vinegar and crushed emeralds. Spoiler, none of it worked. When they went home, if they had a home, life wasn't grand. Plague doctors were often isolated. People feared them, avoided them. Imagine being the guy everyone crosses the street to avoid because you literally reek of death. That was daily reality. Some lived in modest townhouses provided by the city. Others rented cramped lodgings. A few were so poor they bunked near the very hospitals and pest houses they worked in, which, yes, was basically like setting up your bed inside a biological hazard zone. And relationships, let's just say dating wasn't easy. It's hard to impress at a tavern when everyone knows you spend your day knee-deep in plague corpses. And the problem. Now, the contracts sound good on paper. Cities promise plague doctors salaries, usually in gold or steady stipends. They even guaranteed pensions for surviving families, which made sense, since survival was not guaranteed. But here's the catch. Governments are governments, even in the 14th century. Many cities conveniently forgot to pay their plague doctors, or delayed payments until after the crisis, which meant a lot of plague doctors risked their lives for basically nothing. Some actually sued their cities afterward, trying to collect wages owed. Imagine risking your skin in a plague ward and then standing in court later, arguing about late paychecks, the true eternal struggle of workers everywhere. Reputation, hero or ghoul? It might surprise you, but plague doctors weren't seen as heroes. Quite the opposite. Many were despised, mocked, or feared. They were associated with death, not healing. People saw them as omens. If a plague doctor walked down your street, it didn't mean hope had arrived. It meant things were about to get very bad. Satirical pamphlets even made fun of them. Songs and poems mocked their uselessness because, let's face it, their cure rates were abysmal. People noticed that having a plague doctor nearby didn't stop the dying. It just made the statistics more official. So in their private lives, they weren't exactly popular guests at parties. They were tolerated out of necessity, but rarely respected. The actual mask-off moment. Now here's the part we never picture. When plague doctors did finally get home, when they peeled off the beak and hat, what was left? Usually a man in his 20s or 30s, exhausted, frightened, and perpetually half sick. He'd eat a plain meal, maybe bread, cheese, watered wine. He'd try to sleep, often in the same clothes, because laundry was a luxury, and plague didn't exactly encourage fabric sharing. He'd cough, because everyone coughed. He'd check his skin anxiously for buboes, the swollen lumps that meant infection. Every twinge of pain, every fever was a potential death sentence, and many did die. The average plague doctor didn't last long. Some fled their posts in panic. Others succumbed within months. Very few had long careers. The irony of the mask. And here's the kicker. That famous bird mask wasn't even widely used during the Black Death of the 14th century. It became more common in the 17th century during later outbreaks. So when you picture medieval Europe crawling with beaked doctors, you're actually imagining a fashion trend that came later. History once again trolling us with timelines, which means that during the worst plague waves, the plague doctor might not have worn the iconic mask at all. He might have just worn a cloak, carried a stick, and looked vaguely nervous. Still terrifying, but less Instagram ready. Plague doctors in pop culture. Today, the plague doctor is everywhere. Masks at carnivals, costumes at conventions, tattoos, video games. The symbol has stuck because it looks eerie, alien, and mysterious. But behind the costume was often a very ordinary and very miserable man. He wasn't casting spells, he wasn't performing miracles, he was writing death counts and trying not to vomit in his beak. The reality was less dark magic, more dull paperwork, which is fitting, because if there's anything truly eternal in human history, it's bureaucracy. The sleepy reflection. So when plague doctors took off the mask, they didn't reveal sages or saviors. They revealed scared, sweaty, underpaid men who were trying to do a job nobody else wanted. They carried the stench of death home, lived in fear, and often died forgotten. And yet centuries later they became icons, romanticized in art, feared in memory, reborn in costumes. It's one of history's favorite tricks, turning human misery into legend. And so we drift onward again, from witches whose bodies refused peace, to poor men devouring sins, to tasters chewing paranoia, to doctors hiding behind bird masks. The common thread is clear. Death wasn't just an end in the past. It was an event, one that societies staged, managed and ritualized in strange, almost theatrical ways, which makes you wonder, if this is what they did with the dead, what about the children of the living? Those little heirs, sickly, spoiled, and sometimes doomed from birth. Maybe that's where we should wander next, into the cradles of the royals, where the dynastic weirdness began very, very young.